Making the most of the water you do get. This is becoming increasingly important for all of us because the drought in the western part of the United States is getting worse by the day. And here's a picture of it as of June 15th. Now, the thing is, it's not just in the US. If we go a little bit deeper, we see that the drought is existing over all of North America to some degree, way down into Mexico and up into Canada. And if I recall correctly, some of those Canadian provinces are places where they grow wheat. So if the drought causes problems with that, then we have a problem throughout the food supply chain. And the problem is not just in North America. India is having a very severe drought in some places, as is China. And if we look at a map of South America, we see that they are also having severe drought problems in some of their important growing areas. The thing that I think is really essential for managing the water is a moisture meter like this. These only cost about $12 and you can get them on Amazon. There are various types of these. Some of them have multiple prongs and claim that they will analyze soil pH and temperature. I had one of those. I don't think it worked very well for soil pH, and I don't know where it is at the moment. I possibly threw it away. On the one that I got, what I did is I put a piece of black tape about 4 inches from the tip of the probe, and that way I have kind of a consistent depth for testing the various pots that I have in the backyard. Now, in terms of conserving water for in-ground growers, there are two things that you can do. An easy thing is to put mulch on the soil around your plants. This will conserve moisture and it will also protect the top layer of the soil from heat from the sun. A friend of mine recently added this to her tomato plants and she said they picked up considerably. In the whole San Francisco Bay Area, we have had a problem with wind for quite a few months now. And even though it's rather cool, the wind is sucking a lot of moisture out of the ground through the plants. Now, the other thing that you could do for in-ground growing, of course, is to install drip irrigation. And this is a very efficient form of irrigation that puts water on each plant. You may be getting most of your water out of your tap at the moment, but a very important way to conserve water is by doing rainwater harvesting. This has been done for thousands of years all over the world where people have seasonal rainfalls. And, this is true in many places, California being one of them. The way that California traditionally manages this seasonality of the rainfall is by putting in a lot of reservoirs all over the state that capture some rainwater and also capture the snow melt in the spring. The problem right now is that in California during the last season, they only got about 70% of their normal snowpack and only about 50% of the rain. And this has led to a situation where many of the reservoirs in California are at 65% of capacity. Now, the rain that falls on your roof is going to be thousands of gallons in a normal season, and even in an abnormal season, it's going to be a lot of water. And it's going to be more than you can store in tanks, but using some tanks is one way to get some water held back for use in the future. So barrels and tanks are two of the common methods for doing this, and storing water in ground is also a method. You might wonder, how much water do I get when there's an inch of rain? And the answer is that on 1,000 square feet, you get 600 gallons. Something you can do. A lot of people are doing this with just a 55-gallon drum of some kind. You can buy them ready-made like this, or in some cases, people will do homemade systems using recycled 55-gallon plastic drums. Sometimes you can get these from restaurants or you can buy them. You see this mounted on a stand, and something to keep in mind is that when you have a drum like this full of water, it weighs hundreds of pounds. So you need to engineer your stand correctly. And here is the alternative for storing water for people who have more space. These tanks come in sizes ranging from about 500 gallons to 10,000 gallons. Tanks like this are commonly about 6 feet in diameter, and they will be 5 feet or more in height. Another option is gray water systems. This involves reusing water from your bathtubs or showers, from the sinks that are not in the kitchen, and also from the clothes washer. This water can be piped directly into a surge tank and then sprayed on your lawn. Now, you may need to do something in terms of the detergents you use. There are special detergents, quote unquote, organic detergents that will be kind to the soil when you spray them on. And sometimes there's going to be lint and things. But if you think about it, an average clothes washer uses about 40 gallons for each cycle. So that does add up. And you may also need to work with your health department to make sure that this water is safe to use on food crops. My local agent in San Francisco suggested that it should only be used on ornamentals. The issue with this is that it involves modifying your plumbing systems and putting in tanks and so on. So, it's going to be more costly than some of the other things like mulching and drip irrigation. Okay, so in-ground storage is a great thing to do for the water you cannot store in tanks and barrels. A few centuries ago, the king of an Asian country announced that not one drop of water shall flow to the sea. And so he put his people to work building all manner of ponds and channels and things in order to capture all the rainfall that landed on his country. And as a result of that, his country and his people were very prosperous because they could grow plenty of food for themselves. They could trade food and so on. So that was a very smart thing to do. One thing to keep in mind is that the ground is not flat. And that means that water will tend to flow in channels and flow to low areas. There are some exceptions to this in terms of in Arizona, people use special equipment to make the fields as flat as possible for flood irrigation. But in most places, the land will have some slope that you can take advantage of. And this is an illustration of contour lines. And this is what we're talking about, is that as the land flows down in some direction, the water will flow down in some direction, and you can make use of that to harvest water. Now, here is a tool that is very commonly used for setting up land to harvest water. It's an A-frame that is used to identify contour lines on your land. And what you basically do is you set this down someplace on your property and you drive a stake at one end, and then you move the free end or the other end around in a circle until you find another place where the mark on the horizontal beam indicates that it is the same height as the first stake. Then you put a stake in there and you rotate the thing around the second stake and continue to look for the level line on your property. And here's a picture of a couple of kids in Latin America using something like this. And so what happens when you do this, you can lay out multiple contour lines on a piece of property. And then what you do is you dig a ditch along those lines, and you dump the dirt that you take out onto the downhill side of the trench. And what happens when it rains is that the trench fills up with water and keeps it in place, and it gradually soaks into the ground. And here you can see that people are planting on top of the mound of dirt as well as behind the trench. As I mentioned, harvesting seasonal water has been done all over the world for a long time. And here is a traditional form of doing that in India. It's called a Jhalara. And so what they do is they dig a hole in the ground and they line it with stone, and they build steps from the upper levels down to the lower levels. During the rainy season, This thing fills up with water, and then during the dry season, people come with their buckets and take water out as needed. And if this is properly sized, it will provide enough carryover until the next season. Now, when there is a drought, that can change. So, they use things like this. They actually have many forms of water harvesting systems, and I'm including a link to that in my garden tips document. Unfortunately, in recent years or decades even, they stopped relying on some of these traditional systems and went over to just drilling holes in the ground, which worked pretty well until the water table fell to the point where the wells no longer worked. But in recent years, they have started making ponds and other kinds of catchments. And as a result of that, the ground is becoming hydrated and the wells are working once again. Here's another example of India, somewhere in a village where people are harvesting water off their roof. I don't know if this tank is just sitting on the ground or if it extends down into the ground, but it's this tank can probably hold hundreds of gallons of water, so it's a good supply to carry them over. In other cases, on a larger scale, people will build big ponds and use the land to direct the water into these ponds. And there again, the water seeps into the soil, recharges the well, or it can be drawn out of the pond using pumps to do irrigation. Here's a case in Africa where these people have a very large tank. This must be, who knows, 10,000 gallons or something, just coming off their roof. Now, you also see in this picture these rows of rocks, and I think it's possible that these rows of rocks are also being used to direct water around the property. I've seen videos about areas south of the Sahara Desert where people just lay rows of rocks across the land on the contour. And when it does rain, these little rows of rocks do slow down the water flow and cause it to sink into the soil so they can grow more stuff. Here's another case in Africa. I think this is pretty interesting in that I do not see a water harvesting structure here, although it may be that building in the background. But obviously the water must be harvested someplace and then provided to the tank on top of that little tower. Now, something I think I see on that tower is that on the right-hand side of it, it has a solar panel, which may be used to pump water up into the tank, and then which feeds this drip irrigation system down below by gravity. And of course, that's a very important feature of this particular setup, is that they are using the water they do get to feed a drip irrigation system and thus improve their production. And here's an example from closer by. This is from Tucson. And the reason I bring this up is because of a guy named Brad Lancaster, who runs a website called rainwaterharvesting.com and has also written books and done videos about what he does in Tucson. Tucson typically depends upon water from the Colorado River being pumped into the city to provide the water they need. And of course, right now, the Colorado Basin is the scene of some of the worst drought. And so the water supply to the city of Tucson is threatened. When he first moved here a few years ago, he started looking around his property and saw where the water ran and where it gathered, and began to make structures in order to trap some of that water. And then one thing he noticed was that the street in front of his house did have a crown in it, and that therefore water that landed on the street would run off to the sides and to the curb and then into the sewer system where it was lost. And so what they did there is they got permission to start making breaks in the curb in order to let the water from the street flow into little depressions that they either had or made behind the curb, and that provided a lot of water collection for them. So that's the last slide. There's a lot of material about rainwater harvesting and permaculture, which is where the swale idea comes from, on YouTube and on the web. So I encourage you to begin to take some steps on your own to make the most of the water you get. even if you're in a part of the country that's not in heavy drought, you are going to be affected by the drought in California because the drought is causing a dramatic reduction in the amount of produce produced in California. California typically produces about 30% of the fruits and vegetables consumed in the US. And in many parts of California, the amount of irrigation water has been cut dramatically, which means that the yield from these fields will be cut dramatically. So you need to be growing some things using the water you have. And of course, in California, even though the state is harvesting water on a macro scale, we as households and individuals need to begin doing it on a micro scale, because if this drought continues, we are going to find ourselves rationing water, and it's going to be expensive, and we're going to have to make hard choices. And I think if you have to make hard choices, the choice has to go in the favor of producing some of your own food.